Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on a subject, an event that really didn't just make headlines. It fundamentally recalibrated a nation's sense of self. We're going to Bondi Beach for generations. That name was basically shorthand for a kind of Australian exceptionalism.
Summer surfing, right?
Exactly. This idea of a peaceful, secular, egalitarian life that seemed almost magically isolated from all the violent sectarian conflicts that you see plaguing so much of the world.
And that comforting illusion, that whole perception of Australia as this island of safety, it was violently and irrevocably shattered on the evening of December 14th, 2025. What happened there? The calculated and brutal Hanukkah massacre. It's an event we really have to look at through the cold, hard lens of the source material we have.
The numbers alone tell an immediate, grim story. We're talking 16 lives lost,
Yeah.
43 people injured.
43.
And when you just look at those statistics, the Bondi Beach attack immediately and tragically becomes the deadliest terrorist incident in Australian history.
It eclipses Port Arthur.
It does. A scale that exceeds the devastation of the 1996 Port Arthur massacre. The choice of target, the planning, the sheer lethality.
Yeah.
It feels like it was designed to generate the maximum possible national shock.
Oh, it achieved that shock, absolutely. But for us, for this deep dive, our mission today has to go beyond just the emotional horror of it.
Right.
We have to undertake a really necessary and highly detailed chronological reconstruction of how this tragedy unfolded minute by minute. We need to trace the movements of the perpetrators, Sajid and Navita Akram, a father and son team, to truly understand the trajectory of their radicalization.
And it was a very specific intergenerational radicalization, which is key.
It is.
And we also have to spend significant time dissecting the massive interconnected systemic failures that allowed this to happen in plain sight. We're talking about catastrophic failures in intelligence data sharing and, critically, these gaping loopholes in Australia's so-called gold standard firearms licensing that, literally provided the Akrams with a legal arsenal for mass murder.
So this dive is about unpacking that timeline, unpacking the terror, and really examining the institutional cracks that made the devastation possible.
Okay, so let's start by setting the scene, because the context, the location itself, is so key to understanding the psychological impact of this. We're talking about Bondi Beach.
A national stage.
Yes, a projection of Australia's most prized values. It's iconic.
Precisely. It's instantly recognizable anywhere in the world, which the perpetrators knew would guarantee maximum media resonance. It stands for leisure, for openness, and, critically, for a kind of secular integration.
It's so striking there wasn't just an attack on people.
No, it was an attack on the Australian national self-image. But they didn't just strike the beach in general. They were very, very specific about their target.
They targeted Chanukah by the sea. Can you tell us a bit more about what this annual event was like?
So this was the first night of Hanukkah, and it was organized every year by the Shabbat of Bondi. It was meticulously planned to be family-oriented, highly visible, just a celebratory event.
Yeah, and the sources, the witness accounts, they all paint this picture of just pure, relaxed summer bliss.
Absolutely. It was a warm summer evening, 29 degrees Celsius?
Yeah, well after the workday. The famous crescent of white sand was full. You still had surfers in the water catching the last waves.
And then on the grassy knoll of Archer Park, which is right there overlooking the beach, the festival was in full swing.
That's where the crowd was. Over 1,000 attendees.
Over 1,000. And you have to imagine that density. The crowd spanned all ages, from infants in strollers.
There was a petting zoo, face painting.
All the way up to elderly Holocaust survivors, there to celebrate their faith in a country that they truly believed was safe. There was live music, food tables, all in preparation for the big ceremonial lighting of the giant menorah.
That juxtaposition, that absolute joy, that innocent, relaxed scene with the horrific violence that was about to unfold, that's what creates this deep cognitive dissonance.
It really does. It elevates the trauma beyond just the casualty count. And the perpetrators, they aimed to leverage that serenity. Their target selection was profoundly calculated.
We know from their recovered materials this wasn't random violence at all.
No, this was explicit anti-Semitic terrorism.
So if we look at the intent, they were clearly seeking more than just mass casualties. They were trying to strike at something much deeper in the social fabric.
They aimed to maximize both the kinetic impact and the psychological impact. The kinetic goal was pretty straightforward. Fire into the most densely packed, vulnerable crowd you can find.
Right.
The psychological goal was to completely dismantle the deeply held perception of safety within Australian Jewry by striking a Jewish religious celebration at a time of heightened global tension in a place like Bondi. They were sending a message.
And that message was?
The message was, you are not safe, not even here in the heart of Australia.
And the recovery of 2 Islamic State flags from the Akram's car just confirms that specific ideological driver. This wasn't just, generalized rage.
No. This was an attempt to inject violent sectarian conflict into a country that had, for so long, prided itself on being isolated from exactly that kind of thing. Their intent was to challenge the Australian state's ability to protect its minorities.
It sounds like a sophisticated piece of planning.
It was. Designed not only to kill but to polarize society, using one of Australia's most potent national symbols, Bondi Beach, as the stage for their message of terror.
The target was chosen for its resonance, its density, and its symbolic value.
All three. A calculated choice.
Okay, let's unpack the core cell responsible for this attack then. It's 50-year-old Sajid Akram, the father, and 24-year-old Naveed Akram, the son.
Mm-hmm.
What immediately stands out in the source material is that this was not a classic lone wolf scenario at all. It was a deeply interconnected familial operation.
And that dynamic is absolutely key to understanding the systemic failure here. We're looking at what our sources classify as an intergenerational transmission of terror ideology.
A closed-circuit cell.
A closed-circuit cell, exactly. A father-son dyad. This familial structure gave them kind of protective bubble, shielding them from the usual surveillance mechanisms that are designed to flag individuals associating with known extremist groups.
So let's start with the logistical architect, the father, Sajid Akram. He's the one who provided the means to do this, and he did it through entirely legal channels. He was masking the threat behind a veneer of just total normalcy.
Sajid came to Australia in 1998 on a student visa from Pakistan. He later became naturalized, a dual citizen. For nearly 2 decades, he maintained a perfectly integrated life, most visibly as the owner of a suburban fruit shop.
The local business owner.
Exactly. This facade of conventional stability, the local shopkeeper, the clean-skinned father, was absolutely critical to his role in the attack.
And that clean profile is what allowed him to legally access the weaponry.
Precisely. Sajid was the legal key. He had a valid Category AB firearms license, which he had held for about 10 years.
And that category covers what kinds of weapons?
It covers long-barreled weapons, so rimfire, centerfire, lever-action rifles, the kinds of guns traditionally intended for, legitimate farming, pest control, or recreational target shooting.
But Sajid was a fruit shop owner in suburban Sydney. So the question our sources keep asking is, how did he legally justify owning 6 high-powered rifles under Australia's supposedly strict gun laws?
He exploited what we're now calling the genuine reason flaw. Australian gun laws require you to have a demonstrable, legitimate reason for every category of firearm.
So what was his?
Sajid's reason was provided by his membership in the Zastaba Hunting Association, a recreational club out in Monterey. This club membership fulfilled the bureaucratic requirement for a genuine reason without any deeper scrutiny into his actual need, his property location, or what he intended to do with the guns.
So the system just prioritized the administrative box-ticking proof of club membership over any real practical assessment of why an urban resident would need these weapons.
Correct. The NSW Firearms Registry is designed to flag specific risks. A history of domestic violence, certain serious crimes, documented mental health issues.
Things Sajid didn't have.
He had a completely clean criminal record, so he was deemed a fit and proper person, and he didn't trigger any of the automated flags. He was able to legally buy and register all 6 firearms that were ultimately used to murder 16 people. The system failed utterly to connect the soft intelligence, which we know existed about his son, with the hard licensing criteria.
Which brings us to Naveed Akram, the son, the ideological firebrand. Our sources call him the known wolf.
Right, and his profile is the complete inverse of his father's carefully constructed normalcy.
So what do we know about him?
Naveed, 24, was the textbook case of radicalization vulnerability. He was an unemployed bricklayer, recently laid off. He's described as reclusive, socially isolated, deeply susceptible to online extremism, though in this case the most dangerous influence was clearly the intergenerational one.
And crucially, he did not have a gun license himself.
Not at all. He relied entirely on his father's legally purchased arsenal.
But unlike his father, Naveed was absolutely on the radar of federal authorities.
He was a known entity, which is what makes this failure so tragic. ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, had placed Naveed under intense surveillance for 6 months back in 2019.
Why? What triggered that?
It was due to his documented close associations with a Sydney-based Islamic State terror cell, specifically a key figure named Isaac el-Matari, who was an IS operative jailed for plotting major insurgency operations.
So ASIO knew he was associating with active terror plotters, yet they closed the file. What was the rationale for that?
The sources suggest that ASIO made a fatal assessment based on prioritizing resources. At the end of that 2019 investigation, they determined there was no ongoing threat that met the threshold for continuous, costly surveillance.
A catastrophic failure.
It was. It failed to account for 2 key factors. First, the potential for latent re-radicalization, especially in an isolated environment. And second, the critical familial dynamic.
So that federal intelligence history on the son, a known associate of active IS plotters, was never used to trigger a review of the father's state-managed firearms license.
That is the core bureaucratic chasm. Federal intelligence at ASIO focuses on national security and terror threats. State police, the NSW police, managed the civilian firearms registry. The 2 systems were fundamentally siloed.
The dots were there, they just weren't connected.
Because the systems weren't designed to connect them. Naveed's 2019 file was marked closed. That meant there was no permanent flag that would automatically cross-reference his known associations with any firearm license applications in his household.
So Sajid was the legal loophole, the logistical architect who opened the gun safe. And Naveed was the ideological catalyst.
Driving the target selection and the specific anti-Semitic motivation? Yes. The motivation was unequivocally clear anti-Semitic terrorism. The IS flags in their vehicle confirmed that. Their closed-circuit dynamic allowed them to radicalize and plan in total isolation, leveraging the father's clean-skin legal standing to get the weapons. It's the sophisticated use of legal means for lethal ends that really sets this case apart.
Okay, so having analyzed how the Akrams got the legal means and finalized their ideological target, let's now look at the 17 minutes where that planning turned into horrific reality. We need to reconstruct this phase, minute by minute, starting with their pre-attack deception.
Their pre-attack movements really show how calculated they were. They understood they needed a plausible alibi for why they'd be gone.
And the symbol cover story they used was the most Australian weekend activity you can think of, a fishing trip.
That's right. They told their family, including Naveed's mother Verena, that they were heading down to Jervis Bay for some recreational fishing.
A perfect innocuous explanation for being away and for having long-barreled rifles and ammunition in the car.
Exactly, but instead of heading south, they stopped in Campsie, in Sydney's southwest.
What was the significance of that stop?
That short-term rental in Campsie was essentially their final tactical hub. It was where they did their final preparations, went over the operational plans, staged their weapons.
And what's really chilling, and what elevates the sophistication of the plot, is what they did next. Driving their silver vehicle to Campbell Parade, the main road at Bondi Beach.
The secondary threat, the IEDs.
Exactly. Inside that silver vehicle, they had planted several functional improvised explosive devices. This detail is crucial. It tells you this was not a simple shoot-and-run attack.
No, the placement of IEDs is a classic tactic. It's used in complex, coordinated attacks. They're designed to create secondary mass casualties among first responders, police, paramedics arriving on the scene.
Or among victims fleeing the initial attack into the street.
Right. They intended for the death toll to be exponentially higher and for the chaos to be prolonged.
This shows they planned for a multi-stage, drawn-out confrontation. So let's move to the active phase. The clock starts at precisely 18.4 AEDT.
At 18.40, the pair took up their positions. They chose the pedestrian footbridge that spans Campbell Parade and overlooks Archer Park.
A grimly efficient location.
It gave them an elevated vantage point, a clear, unobstructed field of fire directly into the dense crowd gathered below for the Hanukkah festival. They could fire down into the area around the petting zoo and the food tables.
And they fired that first volley right at 18.40. Our sources highlight a psychological phenomenon that happened immediately. Normalcy bias.
It's a recurring tragedy in these situations. The open, breezy acoustics of the beach combined with the fact it's a festival. Witnesses initially confused the sharp cracks of the gunfire for fireworks, or even a loud car backfiring.
That denial, that hesitation must have caused valuable seconds, if not minutes, that people needed to react.
It did. It wasn't until bodies started falling near the food marquees and the petting zoo that the panic became generalized and absolute. The sources detail what the shooters were wearing. Naveed in black, Sajid in a black shirt and white trousers, just firing methodically into the mass of people below them.
Let's just revisit the weaponry for a second, because this is often misunderstood. These were not illegal, high-capacity automatic weapons.
No, they were legally held Category AB rifles, slower bolt-action or lever-action rifles.
So they required manual cycling between each shot, a slower rate of fire.
But that mechanical limitation was rendered entirely irrelevant by the target. Firing down into a dense, contained crowd of over 1,000 people at point-blank range, almost every single one of the 50-plus rounds they fired in that 10-minute span was guaranteed to hit someone.
The lethality came from the density of the victims, not the speed of the weapon.
Exactly. And their operational command was terrifyingly coordinated. They didn't just stay static on the bridge.
No. About 5 minutes in, Sajid Akram, the father, actually descended the stairs from the footbridge down to the park level.
He was aiming to engage victims who were fleeing the scene directly, at closer range. Meanwhile, Naveed remained on the elevated position to provide cover fire, suppressing any organized resistance or attempts to escape.
It shows a terrifying degree of planning.
It does. And below, the scene was just indescribable chaos. The survival anecdotes from the sources, they're just horrific.
What are some of the ones that stick out?
There are accounts of people hiding wherever they could, behind park benches, under the light metal food tables. We read about a survivor, Rebecca, who was hiding under a food table with her young son, shielding him with plastic drink buckets while a man next to them was bleeding out.
And the people who ran into the water?
Yes. Dozens of people, fully clothed, just fleeing the line of fire by running directly into the Tasman Sea, wading out to chest depth just to escape the bullets. The beach, a place of sanctuary, had become a kill zone.
The sustained firing lasted for about 10 minutes. First responders were on their way, but the crucial turning point didn't come from the police. It came from an act of extraordinary civilian courage.
This intervention happened at about 18.47, 7 minutes into the attack. Sajid Akram was on the park level, maneuvering, when he was confronted by a 43-year-old man named Ahmed Al-Laped.
Al-Ahmed, another fruit shop owner who was taking cover nearby.
Yes. Al-Ahmed had been hiding behind a parked car. He saw a critical moment of vulnerability in the terrorist cycle. The sources suggest it was either a momentary difficulty with the reload or maybe a physical stumble.
A split-second opening.
And in that fleeting second, Al-Ahmed made a decision that saved dozens of lives. He charged the armed terrorist.
He physically wrestled the rifle away from Sajid Akram, even though he was unarmed himself.
He did, an unbelievable act of bravery. During the struggle, Al-Ahmed sustained serious gunshot wounds to his shoulder, hand, and leg. But he successfully disarmed Sajid Akram and put the weapon at the base of a nearby tree.
And that one heroic action effectively ended Sajid's ability to continue the massacre.
It did. By this point, emergency services were completely saturated. NSW police officers arrived rapidly. They engaged the suspects in a brief firefight. Sajid Akram was shot dead at the scene.
And Naveed.
Naveed Akram was critically wounded in that exchange and was taken into police custody, which brought the active phase of the attack to a close.
And the site was declared secure by 18.57, just 17 minutes after the first shot was fired.
The immediate post-incident triage was a scene of just intense, grim activity. Sources highlight the resourcefulness of the local surf lifesavers and paramedics who, in the absence of enough stretchers,
They used surfboards.
they used surfboards as makeshift stretchers to rapidly transport the wounded from Archer Park in the sand to the staging areas for ambulances. And then came the grim discovery of that secondary threat.
The realization that the carnage could have been even worse with the IEDs.
The bomb squad subsequently located the improvised explosive devices in the silver vehicle on Campbell Parade. This forced an immediate, highly cautious expansion of the exclusion zone. It delayed the processing of the crime scene, but it confirmed the complexity and the intended lethality of the entire plot. It reinforced that the goal wasn't just 16 dead, but potentially dozens more among the rescuers.
This detailed and tragic timeline brings us squarely back to that central question. How? How, in a country with globally recognized stringent gun control and a robust federal intelligence agency, did a known radical gain access to a legal arsenal used to commit the deadliest terror attack in history?
This is where we have to analyze the anatomy of the known wolf failure. The core issue seems to be less about malice and more about organizational design, that deep chasm between federal intelligence gathering and the operational reality of state law enforcement.
The data
The
silos.
data silos. Let's focus on that intelligence gap involving Naveed Akram and ACO first. What structurally failed? The failure originated in what they call the threshold for investigation. When ASIO closed Naveed Akram's file in 2019, they were acting on a calculus of imminent threat and resource allocation.
So he wasn't deemed a big enough threat to keep watching.
They determined he no longer warranted the expenditure of continuous surveillance resources. This decision, however, failed to create any mechanism for continuous monitoring of his familial environment.
So he fell below the line of active threat and the file was simply closed. It wasn't even tagged as latent risk or something similar.
Precisely. The file was closed, not moved to a dormant monitoring status that mandated a permanent associational flag. And the catastrophic failure was that this extensive federal intelligence history about Naveed's association with the Isaac el-Matari cell was not automatically or even manually operationalized to trigger a cross-reference review of any associated state-managed licenses.
Like his father's NSW police firearms license.
Exactly. The federal agency had the radicalization history, and the state agency had the license to legally purchase 6 high-powered rifles. But the two systems operated in completely separate silos with no interoperable mechanism for flagging associational risk.
It's a bureaucratic crux.
It is. ASIO operates under a national security and threat mitigation mandate. NSW Police Firearms Registry operates under a civilian licensing and public safety mandate. Their databases and their review criteria are designed for different purposes, leading to this functional inability to connect a son's federal intelligence history with a father's state-issued permit.
The system was designed to stop bad individuals from getting guns.
Not bad associations from gaining access to them through a proxy.
And this brings us directly to the vulnerability in Australia's supposed gold standard gun laws, the ones forged after Port Arthur. How was this system circumvented using these Category AB rifles?
Well, the Port Arthur reforms of 1996 focused heavily and very successfully on banning and removing high-capacity semi-automatic rifles and shotguns from civilian hands. However, Category AB weapons, so your bolt-action, lever-action, common shotguns, they were left under a less restrictive regime. They were viewed as essential farm tools or recreational devices. The loophole lay entirely in the legalistic manipulation of the genuine reason requirement.
Which Sajid Akram used with his membership in the Zastava Hunting Association.
Yes. For an urban resident like Sajid, whose primary business was a fruit shop, the requirement that he demonstrate a need for high-powered rifles was met just by presenting paperwork proving his club membership and participation.
The system didn't require him to prove agricultural necessity or even physical proximity to designated hunting lands.
None of it. It was a paper trail fraud that turned a law designed to facilitate rural life into a loophole for stockpiling weapons in a major metropolitan area.
So the argument now is that the term farm tool fundamentally misrepresents the lethality of a bolt-action rifle in a dense, contained urban setting.
Absolutely. The mass casualty count proved that the lower rate of fire is irrelevant when you have 1,000 non-combatants clustered together. The entire risk profile assigned to Category AB weapons before Bondi has to be reassessed.
And the fit and proper person test failed because it was just too narrow in scope.
Utterly. It was focused on the individual applicant's record. Sajid passed the test because he had no personal criminal history. The test had no statutory or procedural ability to weigh the risk posed by his live-in son, Naveed, who, as we established, had documented high-level ties to prescribed Islamic State operatives.
The intelligence existed, the associational vetting did not.
And that led to the ultimate failure of this core safety measure.
This national crisis immediately spurred Prime Minister Albanese to announce plans for the most significant changes to gun law since 1996. The political response was swift and definitive.
And it was driven by the specific mechanics of the Akram case. This legislative pivot aims to close all those identified structural gaps. The most talked about proposal is what's being called the Naveed Rule.
Let's detail the implications of the Naveed Rule. What would it actually do?
It's mandatory legislation that would require state police to explicitly consider the intelligence and criminal history of a licensed applicant's household and close associates.
So it's a direct attempt to stop this clean-skinned father scenario.
It is. It seeks to establish that the presence of a known radical or someone with a specific history of extremism in the home becomes a hard trigger for license denial or immediate revocation. It moves the focus from individual history to associational risk.
And beyond these associational checks, what other measures are on the table to tighten the regime?
There are two other major changes being proposed. First, a move toward a citizenship mandate. The legislation would restrict firearm ownership solely to Australian citizens, excluding permanent residents or long-term visa holders.
And second, a tightening of that genuine reason loophole.
Yes. The government is moving to severely restrict the recreational hunting justification for residents of major metropolitan areas. This will make it significantly harder for city dwellers to justify owning these high-powered rifles without demonstrating a genuine, demonstrable need linked to rural land ownership or agricultural business.
The days of just using a distant club membership as justification seem to be ending.
They do.
Now, switching gears slightly, this crisis played out not just in legislative halls and police stations, but also in the digital information environment. Our sources point to a major failure in technology during the immediate aftermath, specifically the Grok AI chatbot failure.
What's fascinating here is how quickly the information space was just polluted and confused. As news of the attack broke and official information was scarce, Elon Musk's AI chatbot, Grok, was disseminating wildly inaccurate information.
It was hallucinating.
Completely. We have documented cases of the AI making fundamental factual errors.
Give us some of the most alarming examples.
One report states Grok falsely identified the civilian hero, Ahmed, as an Israeli hostage captured during the event.
That's factually inverted and deeply sensitive misinformation.
Completely. In another bizarre instance, the AI claimed that the footage of the shooting was actually a video of Tropical Cyclone Alfred, or, even more nonsensically, a man trimming a palm tree.
A cyclone or a palm tree trimming during the deadliest terror attack in Australian history.
It underscores a dangerous new element of modern crisis management. This reliance on rapid, unverified, AI-generated synthesis during an active, fluid human crisis. It not only confused the public, but potentially obscured the reality of what was happening and the incredible heroism shown by people like Al-Ahmed.
It really shows that the human element, verified reporting, official sources, are still essential.
Essential. Especially when algorithms are prone to such spectacular, damaging, factual hallucinations.
We have to move now to the human cost. The 16 victims represent a profound cross-section of Australian society and a staggering loss across multiple generations.
All right.
Personalizing these individuals is really key to grasping the true depth of this tragedy.
Absolutely. The victims were not just numbers, they were the pillars and the future of their community. The youngest confirmed fatality was 10-year-old Matilda Poltavchenko.
Just 10.
Described in heartbreaking tributes as bright, joyful, and aspiring musician. Her death alone forced a national moment of silence about the vulnerability of children in public spaces.
And the community leaders who lost their lives, like Rabbi Eli Schlanger.
Rabbi Schlanger, 41, was the British-born assistant rabbi at Shabbat Bondi and a key organizer of the festival. He was a father of 5, including an infant who was just 2 months old.
Unbelievable.
Witness accounts confirm he was actively trying to shepherd attendees to safety during the initial volley of fire when he was struck. And then there is the devastating irony of Alex Kleitman.
Kleitman, the 87-year-old Ukrainian Holocaust survivor.
Just think about that biography for a moment. Surviving the horrors of the Nazis and European persecution, finding refuge and safety in Australia, only to be murdered by anti-Semitic terrorism on a tranquil Sydney beach.
And the sources say he was killed shielding his wife.
He was, actively shielding his wife, Larissa, who miraculously survived the attack. It is just a cruel, haunting footnote in history.
And the attack also claimed other vital community figures and individuals.
We also lost Reuven Morrison, who was instrumental in the physical construction of the Shabbat Bondi Synagogue, and Rabbi Yaakov Levitan, the secretary of the Sydney Beth Din. Both were killed in that concentrated initial volley of fire. The impact on the leadership and institutional memory of that community is immense.
And the international ramifications are also clear through the victimology, like the loss of Dan El-Kayem.
El-Kayem was a 27-year-old French national, a talented amateur soccer player who was visiting friends. His death immediately prompted direct diplomatic involvement from French President Macron, which shows how the terror attack reached far beyond Australia's shores.
And Peter Martz-Omegar, the retired police officer.
Yes, he was working at the event as a freelance photographer, documenting the very celebration that tragically claimed his life.
And beyond the 16 fatalities, the psychological toll on the survivors is a long-term public health crisis in the making.
Oh, for sure. The 43 injured required complex physical trauma surgery, But the psychological scars on the hundreds of children who witnessed this carnage unfolding right next to a petting zoo, who saw their parents, friends, and leaders shot, that represents a generational trauma that will require years of mental health support and intervention.
Amidst this profound tragedy, though, the story of Ahmed Al-Ahmed emerged as this singular, potent narrative of societal unity pushing back against hate.
His heroism became a national symbol. Here you have Ahmed Al-Ahmed, a Muslim immigrant and father of two who came from Syria in 2006, consciously tackling an anti-Semitic terrorist to save a Jewish festival crowd.
His father's statement was so powerful.
It was. He doesn't discriminate between one nationality and another. It just captured this universal humanitarian instinct at play. And that image, an act of selfless interfaith bravery, is being leveraged by political and community leaders across Australia to try and maintain social cohesion.
But the sources also make it clear that this cohesion is incredibly fragile, and the attack just acted as a powerful accelerant for existing societal tensions.
The crisis was brewing long before December 14th. Data from the Executive Council of Australian Jewry confirms that in the 12 months before the attack, anti-Semitic incidents in Australia had already risen fivefold.
Fivefold?
Over 2,000 logged events. Everything from harassment to physical assaults and arson attacks on Jewish businesses. The community had been issuing repeated warnings about the writing on the wall, but they were ignored.
And that fragility was immediately tested by retaliatory hate crimes targeting the Muslim community.
Yes, that immediate retaliatory act, the desecration of a Muslim cemetery in southwestern Sydney with pig heads shortly after the shooting. It just underscores how acutely polarized the social environment is. Leaders are fighting desperately to make sure the actions of two radicalized men don't spark a downward spiral of generalized reciprocal hate between communities.
And finally, the fallout went global, impacting Australia's diplomatic and economic standing.
The massacre became a significant flashpoint in the global discourse around conflict and anti-Semitism. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seized on it, explicitly linking the massacre to Australia's perceived softening of its foreign policy.
He said Prime Minister Albanese's recent calls for potential Palestinian statehood recognition pours fuel on the anti-Semitic fire.
Right. And while Albanese rejected that characterization and stood firm on the need for unity, the reputational damage was done.
Because several key international allies, including Israel, the UK, and the US, updated their travel advisories for Australia.
They did, warning their citizens of the potential for terrorism and anti-Semitic violence, a categorization previously reserved only for conflict zones or countries with chronic security instability. It was a profound, humiliating blow to Australia's international reputation and its economic viability as a safe destination. The legacy of Bondi is that Australia can no longer claim exceptionalism in matters of sectarian terror. It is now part of the global security landscape.
So this deep dive has shown us this almost perfect convergence of failures that allowed the Bondi Beach massacre to happen. We saw how Sajid Akram, the clean-skinned father, provided the legal means, the 6 rifles, for his radicalized son Naveed, to execute a terror plot that was sophisticated in its planning, even incorporating secondary threats like IEDs.
And we learned that those 10 minutes of unimaginable violence were decisively terminated by an act of extraordinary civilian courage from Ahmed Al-Ahmed, whose choice to charge an armed terrorist represented a fundamental human instinct pushing back against an ideology of hatred.
But the failure was systemic.
Completely. The federal intelligence apparatus and the state firearms registry were functionally incapable of sharing and correlating the necessary risk data.
And that failure is now driving this legislative change, particularly the proposed Naveed rule, which is an attempt to close that security gap by focusing on associational risk, not just an individual's criminal history.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as Australia embarks on this fraught legislative journey. The Naveed rule mandates that the state must now delve into the intelligence history and close associations of citizens to determine their fitness for something as fundamental as gun ownership.
All right.
If federal intelligence agencies, like ASIO, struggled internally to connect the dots and flag a known associate like Naveed, how efficient and error-free can this massive associational vetting process truly be when it's applied across the entire Australian population?
It's a huge question.
What is the practical trade-off for individual privacy, and how will such a rule impact the delicate multicultural fabric of society when the state is legally mandated to view a family connection as a primary preemptive risk factor?
It is a question of security versus liberty and administrative capacity versus national tragedy that the Bondi massacre has forced Australia to confront. Thank you for joining us on this essential and difficult deep dive. We'll be back next time.